What's cracking? Today's project, electrical upgrades on the Jeep. What I have going on is I'm ready to put a winch on. I've got the winch and the 90 amp alternator that comes original to the Jeep is by all accounts not up to the task of keeping up with a winch. And so a common upgrade is to change it to a 136 amp alternator that can be found on something like a Dodge Durango late 90s model. And that's what I have acquired. I've got one problem though. The connection on the 90 amp that's in the Jeep is a plug-in, and the connections on the new alternator are posts that you use like an eyelet for. And so I have a little bit of converting to do. The new alternator is a little bit bigger, which means I've got a little grinding to do on the bracket. But all this is fairly common, so that's not a big deal. The other thing I'm going to do while I'm at it is I have the Big 7 upgrade kit from jeepcables.com. That's battery cables, alternator, everything like that. And it makes sense to do those all at the same time so that we can maximize the electrical efficiency in the Jeep. So I'm going to get started. The first thing I'm going to do as a safety precaution, I believe I know how to hook up the new alternator, which wire goes to which post, but just in case there happens to be a mishap, I am going to cut the old plug-in pigtail off with enough room that if I need to, I can splice it back on. So here is the new alternator. These are the two posts. Next step, pull the alternator out of the Jeep. So we'll go get the serpentine belt off and start cracking some bolts. So I've got a little bit of bad news. I've got the old alternator out, the 90 amp, and got the bracket. Went to modify the bracket to fit the new one, to discover that this is not the right alternator. If you look at these attachment points, they're kind of off to the side. These attachment points are directly over. That is not even close. So this alternator, which is supposedly for the Durango I mentioned earlier, that part number, yeah, not compatible. Alright, I have done some additional research, and here are some of my findings. I believe that the Jeep XJ around the early 90s, like the 91 model year, changed their alternator from this one to a shape that relatively matches this one, meaning that how these attachment points are directly across from each other, whereas these ones are off to the side. Hence, the bracketry changed. So, since I do have a 4.0, I believe on the bracket that matches this alternator that the attachment points here and the guide points there should still match. And then of course a little bit of grinding for the wider girth, because the output of the alternators was still the same at 90 amps. This one being a little bigger at 136, I will still need to do a little grinding. But I believe I can get a bracket off of a later model to replace this bracket and still get this alternator to fit and to work. So they happen to have a 99 down at the here in Utah. It's called Tear Apart. Pick apart, pull apart, different names across the country, but same idea. Junkyard basically. So I'm going to go down and see if I can harvest the bracket off of that one and if it will work. Fingers crossed. One other quick note. The measurement from this bolt hole to the center of the pulley is the same on both of these. However, I believe that this new model, that this end is the top, whereas on the old one this end is the top. So this is basically inverted. Shouldn't affect how it works, but does affect the bracket. So yet another reason why this one won't work. Obviously doesn't line up, but the new one, this is a through bolt. As you can see, it's intended to go all the way through. On the old one, it did not do that. It did go through the alternator into the bracket, but the bracket is not a pass-through, and the new one, or the one that matches this, is a pass-through because that section is supposed to go in between, like so. And so it basically, the bracket I'm looking for, this should be up on this end, and this down here, etc. So that's what I'm looking for. As far as just measurements go. My other concern with that is if that will affect how the serpentine belt fits. Hope I don't have to get a new one, but we'll see. Now I have returned. Pulled this bracket off of a 99 and pulled both because there were some extra attachment points like this one right here. The old bracket doesn't have, and everything. So I got the bolts, the bracket, and everything. I did measure the holes on the old one and measured them on the new one, and my preliminary analysis is that this should bolt right on. Although I think I do have to go pull this part of this bracket off so this one can go on. Of course, I got all the bolts with it, just to be sure that everything matches threads and whatnot. So this is very promising. I am going to go ahead and take this into my kind of wash basin and clean this up while I've got it out. Might as well put it in clean to match the nice new alternator. Alright, I've got the bracket all cleaned up, a little elbow grease, some crud cutter, did a pretty fair job of it. So now, if I line that up there and then go to line up the bottom, it's off by about half a hole. And it's that area right there, so that's where it needs to be filed down, and that's what I'm going to take. Alright, the bracket fits. You can see from the shiny spots where I had to do the grinding, that spot there in that corner and that one in that corner are to get around the two flare areas right there from the screws. That didn't take much. Of course, the bulk of it was right there. A little more, I would say, off of this one closest to my thumb than the other one. You can see about how much I had to take off. It's not a lot, but I do have it fitting. It's a snug fit, but it is good enough. It will go on. And just FYI, I found probably the most efficient for removing material was this round kind of rasp type of file, and it didn't gall up with the aluminum shavings as much as the other stuff. So that one works really well. I also used a little Dremel with a scraper bit on it. That worked okay. And then just a regular file. And this one did okay as well, but I would have to stop and clean out the files, or it would start to kind of score. Things would get stuck in there, and then they would scrape through. So Anyway, it fits, and that's a big step. Now, as long as this bracket will attach to the engine block in the Jeep, we should be good to go. So this is the other half of the bracket off of the Jeep, the original, and here is the equivalent part on the new one. You can see their design is quite a bit different. However, the 3 mounting bolts right there do line up perfectly. So this should bolt right on, and then that should fit that and also bolt right on. So far, things are working in my favor. The next course of action, I'm going to go put this on so it's ready to go. So after I get this bracket on, I'm going to start doing some wiring, and I'll show you that next. Okay, before I get to the wiring, I was getting a game plan here, looking at things, and came across my first minor dilemma. The bolts that came with the new bracket thread into the other half of the bracket, but the ones on the old one do not. They pass through right here. And so the issue is these are a little bit thicker than the old ones. And since I had to unscrew one of these out of the engine block, I'm quite certain that these will not fit. So I will probably have to use the old ones, which will also pass through the new bracket, but I will need to get a bolt, or sorry, a nut for this other side. So it is a fixable problem, nothing drastic. What I would like to do, I just can't get in there to do it, would be to drill out the holes on the engine block to accept these bigger ones that would then tap into this on the other side. But yeah, that's just not going to be feasible without adding like a whole nother day on my list. Maybe I'll do that later when I replace the AC system and I have to remove the radiator and all that anyway. If I have the right angle, maybe I'll do it then. So I'll save these, but for now, to get it back up and running, go with the old ones. Alright, I am back from getting the nuts and doing a dry fit here to make sure that the bolts are long enough, something I just thought of, to get, you know, all the way through that space, which I'm skeptical now. But also see that there's a little bit of a lineup problem I need to do on this other half of the bracket. Need to do a little bit of relief filing right over here. Alright, that's about how much material I need to take off. That's a lot for just filing, so I think what I'll do is take the Dremel with its cutoff wheel and make pretty quick work of it. Alright, I have that cut out and my fit is now excellent. Works great. So it was a good way to do it. Cleaned it up a little bit, deburred it with the file. This one is ready to go. Now let's finish this test dry fit. I honestly was a little skeptical that these would be long enough, but I've got them in here and I can't show you on the back side, but there is definitely enough room on the back on the other side of this bracket for this bolt or for a nut to get on there and grab. So this will work out just fine. Dry fit is done. I now also a good thing about the dry fit was kind of getting it in my mind how all of this goes together. So for instance, a lot of these bolts need to go through this outer bracket before attaching to the other side, some of them through the alternator. I would have been fussing with that in the vehicle for a bit until I kind of figured that out, but we're there. So I think this alternator is almost ready to go in. The last thing that I need to solve is the two post connections on the other side. Okay, the old alternator connector is cut off and the new eyelets are installed in its place. So I'll put the loom back on here, and then alternator, I think, is ready to go in. Alright, ready to put the brackets on. A quick note. On a hunch, I grabbed one of the new bolts that are a little bit bigger off of the later model, and it turns out that it will feed through the top hole in the block, but the bottom one only goes through halfway, and then it starts to thread on this slightly smaller one from the from my old one, my original. So I've decided to use a bigger one on the top and one of the originals on the bottom, and I will be totally satisfied with how that is going to hold. Yeah, first thing to do is to put this side of the bracket on, and then we'll start feeding some connectors through. So with the added girth of the new alternator, I had to remove the battery and battery tray so I can get it in from the top, because I can't fit it in through the bottom. I might have been able to if I took the fan off. It seemed just as easy to do it this way. So just note for the process. Alright, here we go. Okay, I'm just about wrapped up for tonight. I've got one major issue. My drive belt is no longer the right size. I thought this might be an issue. I may have mentioned it before, but I thought because of the bigger alternator and bigger pulley that it would be too short. It's actually the opposite. It is substantially too long. I'm guessing maybe 2 inches. So yeah, there's absolutely no way this is going to work. So I'll have to do a little research and see if I can figure out what new belt I need, but I can get everything else together, I believe, tonight. So you can see I've already put the battery tray back in. I'm going to put the battery in, not hook it up, and then I've got just the 2 little wires on the alternator, and that'll do it for tonight. I have a new belt. It is a 98 inch, or shade over 98. I looked at a 1992 model year, which used the new alternator points, similar to what I put on, and this was the size belt they ran. And for comparison, I looked up my original, and it is supposedly a 103 inch, so we're 5 inches shorter. And that seems, from just looking at it, I believe that's going to be about the right amount of length that we need to reduce. New belt is on. I've got it tensioned, I think, appropriately, but I did not tighten the other bolts here on the power steering pump. I'm going to start it first, see if there's any adjustments, any other tightening that needs to happen before I cinch those down. But I think it's time to give it a whirl, so I'm going to get these battery cables on and start it up and hope that I have the right leads in the right places on the alternator. So far so good. Battery leads are on. Nothing's smoking or making any funny sounds. You can see I do have power. So let's give her a rip here. I'm going to try to set the camera up for you to capture this, for the first start. Since I took the fuel rail off before I start, I'm just looking for any leaks. Looks like it pressurized fine. Not seeing anything or smelling anything. Alright, let me check the voltage. Alright, voltage is reading 11.9. It has been unhooked for, it's been unhooked since the weekend, so it's been about 5 days. So, but nothing's smoking or anything yet. Everything's still on. Let's fire it. Looks good out here. It's all tracking. It's pretty quiet. My voltage on the inside, see here, my voltage on the inside here is reading in the red. However, this one is reading 12.0. Let's rev it a little bit, see what happens. I'm getting nothing. That's holding. But I don't think it's charging. Alright, I'm gonna have to put in a phone call. Okay, I called my buddy Joe. He had me grab the multimeter and do a check, and was alarmed when it came back at over 15 volts, and it climbed steadily until it peaked at about 19.5. I took the battery out of the Jeep, set it over there. He asked, is it bubbling? Is it swelling? Anything like that? None of that was happening. I touched it all on all four sides. It wasn't hot. So he said, well, maybe your multimeter's bad. I thought that's weird because it should be, I think this is a pretty decent multimeter. So on a hunch, I first checked on the four-wheeler, which was also reading quite high in 15-16 range. So I went and grabbed a new battery for the multimeter, and now everything is reading right where it should be. Both batteries are in the 12 to 13 range. So bad battery in the multimeter was the culprit there. So I fired it up again. He said put load on it and see what happens. So I turned on the lights, the fog lights, the heater, fan full blast, and the rear defroster. And my voltage on the battery went down to about 11.5. He said shut it off. It shouldn't drop that low. The alternator should kick in and you should be up around like 13.5. So we discussed the two leads down on the alternator, and he said go ahead and switch those around, start it up again, and hit it, get the multimeter on it and see what your reading is, see what happens. So that's where we're at, and just to make sure, I'm going to just double check, and it appears fuse is intact. So we didn't blow a fuse on the alternator. Sorry, I meant to turn you on and come along for the ride. I just started it up. Started at about 12.5 volts. turned everything on, dropped down to about 11.6. Yeah, so those terminals don't seem to have made any difference. Well, I'm a little bit bummed out. I was cautiously optimistic that this would work and I could get the winch put in today, but it doesn't look like that's going to happen. I've tried the terminals both directions. There is very minimal difference between the two, although the original way I had it does seem to give me half a volt better readings. But the battery doesn't seem to be losing power, but it certainly doesn't seem to be gaining power either. So I just talked to Joe again. He had me start it up again and rev it up to 3,000 to 4,000 RPMs, see if I got any change in the voltage, which I did not. So then I consulted the pictures, sent him links to what I had purchased, both the cable, the new battery cable upgrades, and the alternator. He's kind of thinking maybe I just have a bad alternator, but in consulting the pictures that I used from the forum for how to connect it, I realized that I did connect the two terminals backwards. So I'm going to go under and switch them again. He said try the rev test again after that, see if I get any increased voltage, and then we'll take it from there. Update. I've done some research and I found out I think what might solve the problem. In the 91 model year, Jeep made a couple of changes, including changing the alternator, both the shape and the manufacturer. One of the other key things is that they went from an internally regulated alternator to an externally regulated alternator. So my alternator upgrade needs something to regulate it from the outside. I don't have the computer to do that in the Jeep, and so I need to get an external regulator. I called Joe, talked to him about it. His expertise is automotive electronics, and so I asked him, could this be the problem? And he said absolutely. In fact, it most likely is. And so while we were on the phone, we both got on the computer and looked up a couple things, talked some options. I think I'm going to get an adjustable external regulator. I will probably order that in the next day or two. So for now, this project is on hold, but fingers crossed that solves my alternator issue, because that will tell the alternator when to start charging the stuff that was hooked up to it, namely the battery on the Jeep. Ready to get back on this project. I have acquired my MechMan external regulator. I've got some things that I am a little disappointed about just from unpackaging. The instructions are clear and detailed, two-sided. This one's just the general hookup, and then it references one to the relay, and on the back it has a pretty specific breakdown of the relay. Speaking of the relay, they did send a relay harness, but not a relay. That's one of my disappointments. For the cost I shelled out for this, I really think that they could have included a relay. The other thing, two other things I'm a little disappointed about is they didn't really send any wire. And I suppose that's justifiable, not knowing how much is going to be needed. But again, for how much money I shelled out for this, I would think that they could have included a couple of feet of 10 gauge wire to get this properly hooked up. So I'm going to have to run to the store and get the recommended 10 gauge wire that's required for most of these connections. As part of that, they also did not send any eyelets to hook up. So you can see got some, 3 terminals to hook up on the regulator itself, and they didn't send me any wire eyelets or anything for those. I have to supply my own. For the cost, honestly, that's disappointing. Now here is the regulator itself, and here is my last kind of disappointment. It is adjustable, which means it has this switch, but this switch is hardwired into the gauge, which means if I want to mount this internally in the cabin but leave this in the engine bay, I have to drill a big old hole to feed this through. I'm not too excited about that. I'm thinking I'll probably put this all in the engine bay, including this, because I don't think I'm going to be adjusting it very often. So I'll probably just kind of set it and forget it. But another aspect of that is that this cable is, 3, maybe 4 feet long? That's not nearly long enough to keep the regulator within it says that the regulator should be mounted within 6 feet of the alternator. So the length of this really limits where I can mount this in the engine compartment if I wanted this on the inside. It would almost certainly have to go against the firewall. So a couple things I think MechMan could rethink. And I do think there is a little more value that could be had out of this. I think they cheaped out in a few places. But overall, if it works, I will be satisfied. Okay, I've got everything hooked up. Moment of truth. I just turned that gauge on, and it was reading 13, but I also just took the battery tender off, so it may have been charging, which makes sense why it's now dropping. So I'm going to take you outside and give you the rundown, and then we're going to put some power to it and see what happens. Alright, once again, this is just temporarily hooked up. So I've got this hooked up to an ignition source, which it's hooked up to the same ignition source that goes to the alternator. That's the one that I know turns on. I hope that's not going to be an issue. I've got the fuse hooked up to the positive battery that goes to the relay, which goes to positive on the new regulator. Negative goes directly to negative on the new regulator. And from the relay, I'm grounded. And then I've got my 2 going down to the alternator. Now those are the 2 I'm worried about, because on forums I've come across, it shows this post as being positive and this one negative, but according to MechMan it should be kind of the other way around. That's the only thing I'm unsure about, because I'm getting conflicting information. Well, with that said, let's give it a shot and see what happens. So I've got my assistant inside, and let's see here. Okay, let's go to auxiliary. Okay, I don't see anything happening. Hopefully that's good. What does the gauge read? 12.2. Okay, gauge is reading 12.2. What about the gauge in the cluster? Yeah, the battery one. Same as before? All right. Okay, start it. I don't see anything smoking. Okay, let's see. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12.2. 12. lights are going crazy. Is that saying 19?
19.7.
What does the gauge up there say?
19.
19. Is it going down? Did they go down? Went up? Okay, shut it off. Okay, Jeep's not shutting off.
Yeah, it won't turn off.
Okay, that was exciting. Okay, that's what it should be. Alright, I need to make a phone call. Alrighty, I am back on the Jeep after a couple weeks to decompress on this whole situation. And we're going to give this a go here. So I have switched the wires on the terminals on the alternator itself so that they now match the Mechman diagram that came with the regulator. And I have rerouted this signal wire to the fuel pump relay, which was that one, sorry, this one right here. And so now we're going to give it a shot as soon as I put a new battery in this camera, because it's about to die. Okay, before we even start, I've got a couple weird things going on. Number one, the key is in the off position, and yet my transmission switch light is on. That should only be on when the auxiliary is on. So that's a little strange. Everything else appears to be working normally, except that I have no fuel pump. I did not hear the buzz when I turned the key. I've done it 2 or 3 times now, so let's go. So I need to interject here. I don't know what happened to the next video clip, but let me summarize my next experience. So I started the Jeep again, and like the time before, the voltage spiked, hitting about 19 on both gauges. And so I went to turn it off. Again, the key wasn't working. At this point, I had moved the signal wire from the alternator, former alternator wire, to the fuel pump relay. But the Jeep still didn't turn off. So again, I went and pulled off the negative battery terminal, and somewhat to my panic, it still didn't shut off. So I grabbed the wrench, got the positive terminal, and took the positive off. And then I really started panicking because it still kept running. With the battery completely disconnected, it was still running. And at this point, I'm thinking, how am I going to get this thing to shut off? I ended up getting it to turn off by pulling the fuse out of the signal wire. So I'm not sure what was causing the Jeep, the voltage to spike. I'm sure the reason it kept running is because I didn't have that signal wire hooked up correctly, which I will address further on in the video. But having the original wires on the posts along with the wires from the new external regulator, I'm wondering if that was causing some confusion with the computer or something. I don't know. But at that point, I decided I was pretty much done with the MechMan external regulator. It just seemed cumbersome and wasn't working. And so that's when I decided to go with one that I had seen on some other YouTube videos that people seem to be happy with. So I got online and I ordered what you are going to see next. All right, back on the Jeep. Going to try something new with this alternator issue. I'm going with a different kind of regulator. This is by Quick Start. I did order this directly from the company, although they have several things that look identical to this on Amazon. I just wanted to be sure. This is for Dodge, Chrysler, and Jeep vehicles in my era. It did come seemingly with everything. I got the whole kit. So I've got my instructions with my diagram here. The regulator and the harness. This goes into the regulator. Got this one's a little simpler than the MechMan as far as hookup. We've got one wire that goes to a switched source. These two go down to the alternator, and it plugs into here. And then they did also include this, which they call the field replacement module, and it says it goes between the two field wires that go to the back of the that go back to the computer. So the two field wires that are previously connected to the alternator, which leads me to postulate that perhaps part of my problem is that I've had those wires still connected to the alternator. It also says that it is that is optional. You may not need it. It's intended to keep the check engine light from going on, but I don't have a check engine light, so that's not an issue. So I may put it on just because I don't want dangling wires. But other than that, there is an option that they recommend to also include a relay like the MechMan did. And that is not included in the kit, but they do show you how to hook it up if you want to go that route. I'm going to try hooking it up this simple way first and see if that solves the problem. First thing to do is I need to get some eyelets put on these two so they can hook to the posts on the alternator. And then, like before, we'll go plug it in and start it up and cross our fingers we have more success, because I'm about at my wit's end with this project. It's been a minute. I'm finally getting back on the Jeep. Let me tell you what has happened thus far. A couple weeks ago, I needed to move the Jeep to get something out of the garage, and thought, well, maybe I can start it long enough to just move it over to my side pad. I went to start it, and the battery did not have enough juice. I put a jump pack on it, and my jump pack I haven't charged in a while, and it almost started it, but not quite. So I charged that up. I put a battery charger on the battery in the Jeep, still connected to the Jeep, and let it sit overnight, and then had to take it off while I left town for a weekend. I took it off, and there was no noticeable improvement in the charge of the battery. And it got me thinking that maybe that 20-volt surge on the 3 occasions, I don't remember now, had fried my battery. So it has sat for a couple weeks. On Tuesday, I took the battery out. I put it on a charger independently, just by itself. It seemed to take a charge. I charged it for several hours. I took it to my local O'Reilly's, had them test it, and it tested good. Today is now Saturday. I just put the multimeter on it, and it is reading 12.8 volts. So in its normal range, it is holding its charge. So what's draining my battery? Well, what I have found, kind of accidentally, getting ready to put this new regulator in, I got confused on one of the wiring aspects, which I will show you in a moment. I went and watched a couple videos on YouTube University, and one guy said there's a wire that the wire that hooks up to an ignition source. If you hook it up to the wrong one, it will just constantly be on, and that will drain your battery. Well, it turns out that is a mistake that I had made. That ignition source, I put it on a constantly powered circuit instead of just an ignition circuit. So I need to fix that. I'm thinking that the previous alternator, a regulator, was draining power out of the battery consistently. So maybe I will get that fixed. Now let me show you my confusion with the wiring. We've gone over this, but just I will rehash a little bit. I've got the main wire that plugs in, red and black. As you can see, I've already put the ends on, and that's ready to go. I understand that one, and I've got the other little wire that is part of it that goes to the ignition source. That all makes sense. What is confusing me a little bit is this statement right here. Regulator case must be grounded to both alternator and battery. So they've got the diagram showing wire here. That I understand. What's confusing me a little bit is how to connect it also to the alternator. Can that be separate wires? Just maybe connected to the same post here? Anyway, I've got to go sort that out. I'm going to go pop the hood and see if I can make sense of it. I do believe I am missing a negative or a ground from the alternator case. So I'm going to go look at that. And I believe that that's what this extra wire is for that came in the kit, which looks to be, I'm guessing, 10 gauge. So that's what I need to go sort out. That's what I'm confused about. As soon as I get that worked out in my mind, then I think I'm ready to put this on. Okay, so I've just confirmed a couple of things. Let me walk you through here. So I've got the positive cable from my positive terminal on my alternator that goes to the fuse, through the fuse to battery positive. I have a ground from the frame and the engine block to battery negative. What I don't have is a ground from the alternator housing to the frame of the vehicle. So that is missing. So I will add that. Probably. This is easy access right now. Makes sense to put it on here. Should transfer from that case. And then, like I said, I also need to, I did put the ignition source was on the fuel pump relay, which I believe is the second one if I remember right, but I put it on the wrong wire. So I need to fix that, and the easiest way to do that is to just pull this whole relay box off so I can kind of get underneath it. Okay, I have come across one more thing that's added to a little bit of my confusion, and that is this right here. must run an additional ground wire between alternator, voltage regulator, and battery negative. So, I'm not an electrician, so this diagram is flustering me just a little bit, but here's what I have so far. I have made 2 ground wires. One that goes from the alternator case that I'm going to attach to battery negative. Then I made another one that goes from the regulator case that I'm also going to put on battery negative. I'm going to try that, and if needed, I will do one more from the regulator case to fender or some such. Okay, I have an apology to make. I didn't think to turn the camera on for the initial test. But let me tell you what has happened over the last few minutes. So I got this hooked up. I just used a clamp to ground out the regulator box. So that is grounded to the battery, and then this other wire is from the alternator to the battery. And I figure since they are touching by proxy, the alternator is grounded also to the regulator through that connection there. So obviously I got the battery put in, got the terminals on. I tested it with the multimeter, and the battery was reading 12.8. I got in the cab, and my digital reader in the cab was reading 9. I thought that's weird, especially since the battery's supposed to be fully charged. I tried to turn it on, tried to start it, and everything went dead. Lights went out, everything. So I came out, I fiddled with the terminals a little bit. This light flickered and went back on. Seemed brighter than it was before, so I went and tried it again. Same result, came out, messed with these again. Turns out, I don't know if you can tell from previous video, I'll see if I can bring it up, but this post after the 19 volt output seemed like it was a little bit charred or black on the top. You can still see some of the discoloration on the terminal here. Well, I noticed as I would rotate this that this light would go dimmer or brighter. So I grabbed a wire brush, cleaned off this post on the battery, put this on. I was then at that point getting a reading of 12 in the cab. So I should have started filming at that point. Sorry, I did not. I turned it on, and a couple of good things here. I'm happy to report. Let me turn on this my digital. So you can see it's reading right now 12.4. Let's fire. Jeep fired up. You can see my dash one is reading just under 14. Digital reading 14.915. It's been consistent. I turned that on and then saw that reading, turned it off. Fortunately, it is now working with the key on and off. That's a big plus. I called my buddy Joe, said, hey, this is the readings I'm getting. He said 15 is fine. As long as you're not crossing over into 16 volt output, you should be totally fine. So I am happy to report that this gauge is working. I was worried I would have to go without that and my OCD would just irritate me. I'm getting consistent readings on this. They seem to be about a volt off from each other, but that's okay. So I think I have this figured out. So I've got a couple of things to button up, get the battery put in. I've got a couple wires to do, and I'm also going to obviously now permanently affix this regulator to I think the firewall under this coolant reservoir bracket. That's where I plan to do it initially. It seems like the best place. I just don't feel like I have room. I've seen people mount it like right here, but with this AC hose going through there, which I'm going to replace, that's one of my next projects. Yeah, it's just, I like it being under there a lot better. So I'm gonna get that done. This is a happy day, and I think I'm pretty much having this project tied up now. I'm super excited and relieved. Jeep is back in action just in time for adventure season. Okay, so I decided the easiest thing to do was to go ahead and pull off the tray that holds the reservoir. I did not have to disconnect the reservoir, and that was 2 bolts, 10 mil, one here and one there. Pretty easy, worth the time. And then I got the regulator kind of set where I wanted, and happened to notice there's some holes already in the firewall. I don't know how well you can see those. Not all of them line up, but there's one in particular right down here. I don't think there. Maybe you can see that one. That's perfect for one of the mounts. I've decided to orient it this way just in case I need to hook up to it. There's that hole. You see the big hole in the bracket that would make this really easy to reach, just right through that. So I'm going to mount it this way, kind of upside down, and that little hole lines up with that one perfectly, and that will hold this in place while I get the other 2 drilled. I'm using some self-tapping screws that I happen to have. They are just said on the package 14. Alrighty, I have tightened up the bolts on the power steering pump, so that's not going anywhere. Belt is properly tensioned. I got everything hooked back up here. Got my 2 grounds to alternator and regulator, and my battery maintainer. It's all hooked up. Everything's back on. Brackets on, and you can see tucked down in there is the new external regulator, and that is super exciting. And I also, the field interrupter, as they called it, I don't know if you'll be able to see it really, but I found a hole in a bracket down there. Yeah, you can just see it. And I just put a zip tie to that, through that bracket, and zip tied it on for now. I'll check it after I've driven it a bit and see. Supposedly those get hot. We'll see if it melts through the zip tie. If it does, I'll mount it someplace else, but for now I am satisfied. This is a huge relief that I got this to work. It has been weighing heavy on my mind. All in all, it was a 2 to 3 day project that I spread out over a couple of months. With the trouble and the weather and everything, it just kind of beat me down a little bit, but I am super excited that this is working. The Jeep is back in action, and now I may be even more excited that I now feel comfortable putting the winch on. But that is another video. So right now, let me say thanks for watching, and I appreciate your support. If you found this helpful or entertaining, please hit the like, leave a comment. I'll see you on the next one.